The Chimney-Sweeper, by the English Romantic poet William Blake, first appeared in 1794 in the volume Songs of Experience, 5 years after he published Songs of Innocence. The poems in Songs of Innocence present an idealised and optimistic view of life, focusing on purity, joy, and the innocence of childhood. In contrast, the poems in Songs of Experience present a much darker and more cynical view of the world. They address themes of corruption, suffering, and the loss of innocence, often criticising social and religious institutions. The poems in this volume reflect Blake's growing disillusionment with the world as he saw it. The two volumes were later combined under the title Songs of Innocence and Experience, showing the two contrary states of the human soul, to illustrate Blake's belief in the dual nature of the human condition, the coexistence of innocence and experience, light and dark, joy and suffering. In The Chimney-Sweeper, a companion poem to its counterpart in Songs of Innocence, an unnamed adult speaker chances upon a weeping chimney sweep in the snow. When he asks him where his parents are, the young boy takes over the narrative and explains that they are in church praying. Once a child full of innocence and joy, he is now full of despair, condemned as he is to a short and brutal life. Ignorant of their child's real suffering and believing that they have acted in his best interests, his parents have gone to church to offer up their praise. Poverty often drove families to sell their children into chimney sweeping or other forms of labour. In 18th and early 19th century England, when William Blake wrote his Songs of Innocence and Songs of Experience, poor families had few options for survival, especially if they were large or lacked a stable income. Selling children to a master chimney sweep provided a small financial benefit and relieved the family of the responsibility of caring for them. Chimney sweeps often started as very young children because small bodies were needed to climb into narrow, soot-filled flues. The work was hazardous, with risks of respiratory illnesses, burns, and even deformities from prolonged crawling in confined spaces. This harsh reality of child labour deeply troubled social reformers of Blake's time, and his poem The Chimney-Sweeper exposes these conditions, contrasting the innocence of children with the bleak reality of their exploitation. The church in Blake's time often justified child labour through a combination of religious, economic and moral reasoning that aligned with the broader societal norms of the 18th and 19th centuries. The church taught that everyone had a God-given place in society. Poverty and hardship were often seen as part of God's plan, with the expectation that suffering faithfully would lead to rewards in heaven. Religious teachings often emphasised obedience to parents and employers as virtues, which extended to children working under harsh conditions. Hard work was often equated with moral goodness. Labour, even for children, was seen as character building and a way to instill discipline and responsibility. It was commonly believed that idleness led to sin, and so keeping children occupied was seen as a way to save their souls. The poem comprises 3 stanzas of 4 lines, otherwise known as quatrains. Although the poem does have a rhyme scheme, note that it is not regular, with the first quatrain featuring rhyming couplets, i.e. A, B, B, with the second and third featuring alternate rhyme, i.e. A, B, A, B. Most rhymes are single or masculine in that the rhyme falls on the final stressed syllable, e.g. snow and woe, although there is one example of double or feminine rhyme in the final stanza, i.e. misery and injury. Line lengths vary between 8 and 11 syllables, and the poem's metrical or rhythmic structure is also irregular, with a mixture of iambs, didum, and anapaests, dididum, e.g., a little black thing amongst the snow, with an occasional spondy, dum-dum, e.g., weep, weep, for emphasis. Blake's diction is characteristically plain and simple, although it is also highly symbolic and rich in meaning. He often used straightforward language, which made his poetry accessible to a wide audience. But this simplicity was intentional, allowing him to communicate powerful messages in a direct way, making his work both resonant and impactful. In isolation, the title, The Chimney-Sweeper, is fairly self-explanatory. It does, however, take on deeper significance when considered alongside its companion poem, The Chimney-Sweeper, in Songs of Innocence. Although both poems share the same title, their contrasting contexts and tones provide a powerful commentary on Blake's view of the human experience. In Songs of Innocence, the poem portrays a young chimney sweep in a more optimistic, naive light, where suffering is seen as something that can be overcome through spiritual faith and innocence. In Songs of Experience, however, the same figure represents the darker side of life, where the child's suffering is more fully acknowledged and criticised. The innocence of the earlier poem is replaced with the harsh reality of exploitation and societal neglect. By using the same title for both poems, Blake underscores the stark contrast between the two states of being: innocence, naivety, purity, and spiritual faith, and experience, disillusionment, suffering, and societal critique. The repetition of the title creates a sense of unity, while also highlighting the profound shift in perspective between the two volumes. The poem begins, "A little black thing among the snow." On a literal level, this description reflects the boy's physical condition as a chimney sweep, covered in soot to the point of being unrecognisable. The contrast between the child's blackened appearance and the white snow emphasises his degradation and isolation from the natural world. The word thing dehumanises the child, suggesting that he is viewed as a mere creature. On a metaphorical level, the contrast between the black of the boy and the white of the snow becomes symbolic. We could argue that Blake is ironically describing him as society sees him, as a being besmirched and blackened by original sin among the snowy white purity and idealised virtue of the church and society. The church's doctrine of original sin justifies the suffering of the innocent child, framing this as a form of redemption or expiation for humanity's inherent sinfulness. By opening the poem in this way, Blake exposes the dissonance between the church's teachings of purity and salvation and the grim reality of its complicity in human suffering. The child, an emblem of innocence, is paradoxically branded as impure by the very system that should protect him. He continues, crying, "Weep, weep," in notes of woe. The verb to weep means to shed tears, and woe is another word for great sorrow. Blake skillfully uses sound patterning here to emphasise the child's distress. Note the epizeuxis present in weep, weep, and the alliteration of the semi-vowel w here, in combination with the repetition of the long e sound, which creates a high-pitched, reedy quality that orally mimics the thin, weak voice of a young child crying for help. The boy's youth and physical frailty and vulnerability is also further emphasised by the assonance of the long O sound in notes of woe, which mimics a sound of despair. Note also the use of an apostrophe in front of the word weep to indicate that a letter is missing. In reality, chimney sweeps often called out "sweep, sweep" to advertise their services. Blake's use of "weep, weep" plays on this, transforming a cry of labour by a young child whose underdeveloped language skills leads him to struggle to pronounce his words clearly, into a cry of pain and despair. This pun further reinforces the dehumanisation of the child, whose very voice is reduced to the very labour that defines his existence and creates a strong sense of pathos. In the next line, the unidentified adult speaker addresses the child, asking him, "Where are thy father and mother, say?" The possessive pronoun thy is a now archaic word for your, which was used to express familiarity and was either used among people who were intimate with one another or to people who were of a younger age or lower status. This is similar to words such as ton, tuo, and tu that are still used in languages such as French, Italian, and Spanish. This line, therefore, introduces a sudden intimacy that contrasts with the earlier dehumanisation of the child, making the situation feel even more personal and heartbreaking. The question subtly accuses the absent parents, while simultaneously drawing the reader's attention to the broader systems that allow such suffering to persist. It sets up the child's response, which is even more devastating in its naivety and acceptance of his fate. They are both gone up to the church to pray. This line marks a pivotal moment in the poem as the child's voice emerges to take over the narrative. The shift to the child's voice creates an immediate contrast between the adult's perspective and the child's innocent yet resigned explanation of his plight. This naivety makes the situation all the more poignant and highlights how the child seems to have internalized his suffering as normal. By allowing the child to speak, Blake empowers the figure that society typically silences. The child's testimony becomes a form of evidence against these systems of exploitation and hypocrisy. The revelation that they have both gone up to the church to pray juxtaposes the parents' spiritual pursuits with their neglect of their child's physical and emotional needs. This abandonment is both literal, they are physically absent, and symbolic. They have relinquished their responsibility by entrusting the child to harsh labour. The line suggests that the parents believe they are fulfilling their duties by seeking divine approval for their choices. It reflects the pervasive influence of religious teachings that prioritized suffering as a path to salvation. In the second stanza, the child remembers a time of happiness, purity, and innocence. "Because I was happy upon the heath and smiled among the winter snow." A heath is an expanse of grassland and suggests a contrast between the open countryside where the boy has spent his earliest years and the claustrophobic and filthy urban conditions in which he now lives and works. The breathy alliteration of the aspirated in happy and heath emphasises his former contentment in this natural setting. The juxtaposition of the child's previous smile with his current weeping underscores his loss of innocence. The snow, which now symbolises coldness and suffering, was once something the child didn't feel, an indication of his prior emotional and spiritual warmth. The use of the causal conjunction "because" at the beginning of the line implies that the child's former state of happiness and ignorance of sin was intolerable to the Church's doctrine. This subtly criticises a system that thrives on guilt and suffering, rather than fostering natural joy and freedom. The boy's punishment for his former happiness was that they clothed me in the clothes of death and taught me to sing the notes of woe. There is a certain ambiguity in the use of the pronoun they here, which is deliberate and powerful. It seems to implicate both the parents and the church, thus creating a web of blame. The parents are directly responsible, even if they are unaware of it, for the child's physical suffering, while the church is responsible for the ideological framework that justifies it. This lack of clarity forces the reader to see the child's suffering as systemic, enabled as it is by societal norms, parental actions, and religious teachings alike. The clothes of death can be interpreted literally as the soot-covered rags that blacken the child. They can, however, also be interpreted on a metaphorical level to allude to the inevitability of an early death due to the physical toll that chimney sweeping had on very young, underdeveloped and often malnourished boys. The polyptonic repetition of clothed and clothes intensifies the claustrophobic tone and underscores the oppression that these boys suffered. Note that the boy has had to be taught to sing the notes of woe, while smiles came to him naturally. This line reinforces Blake's criticism of religious and societal institutions. Instead of fostering joy and freedom, these systems impose suffering as a moral and spiritual obligation. The repetition of notes of woe from the first stanza emphasises the enduring and cyclical nature of this suffering. The child's learned sorrow starkly contrasts with the innate happiness he once knew, highlighting Blake's belief that suffering is an artificial construct rather than a natural state. The final stanza begins, "And because I am happy and dance and sing." This line is slightly confusing due to the present tense, am. How can he be happy and dancing and singing if he is woeful in the snow? It could simply be that to put it into the past tense would have necessitated danced and sang, which would have messed up the later planned rhyme with king. It could, however, also be interpreted as an indication of an enduring hope of salvation, a temporary relief from despair that comes from clinging to religious promises, even if they are ultimately hollow. This links back to the companion poem in Songs of Innocence, where the children find genuine solace in religious belief, imagining angelic visions of freedom and warmth. Then down a green plain, leaping, laughing they run. And Tom was happy and warm, so if all do their duty, they need not fear harm. Note the polysyndeton in this first line, the simplicity of the syntax evoking the child's own simplicity and ingenuousness. Because the child seems to have shown no sign of his distress to his parents, they are in a state of blissful ignorance, or perhaps wilful denial, of the harm they have caused. They think they have done me no injury. There is more than a suggestion that they have rationalised their actions as being in the child's best interest, either spiritually or materially, while turning a blind eye to the terrible conditions in which he would have lived. And this is why they are gone to praise God and his priest and king, who make up a heaven of our misery. Note the polysyndeton here, which seems to imply that Blake connects religion and government in a unified system of exploitation, not only suggesting that both are complicit in perpetuating the suffering of the vulnerable, but also that the individual's relationship with God and/or spirituality is mediated by more worldly concerns. In other words, you can't have one without the others. The verb make up is crucial here, as it suggests a fabrication or invention, implying that the promise of heavenly rewards is a constructed narrative designed to pacify and control the oppressed. The oxymoronic heaven of our misery is deeply ironic and underscores the hypocrisy of the system. A true heaven, by definition, cannot coexist with misery. The church and state claim to be working towards a moral and spiritual paradise, yet it is built on the suffering of the vulnerable, like the chimney-sweepers. On a literal level, the heaven could refer to the comfortable lives led by the wealthy, who prospered as a result of the misery of what was effectively slave labour. As Blake concludes the poem, he forces the reader to confront the paradox of a system that purports to save souls while destroying lives. Thanks for watching. If you have any questions, please let me know in the comments section below and I'll do my best to answer them. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more videos on English language topics and exam techniques and English literature texts.